There's a photograph from 1962 that basically summarizes the 20th century. Elizabeth Taylor is stepping off a yacht in the Mediterranean, dripping in diamonds that could literally buy a small country. The press is losing their minds. Cameras are clicking like a swarm of cicadas. Click, click, click. And she looks like a goddess. But if you look closer, really look into those famous violet eyes, you aren't looking at a woman in her prime, you're looking at a survivor. By the time she was 30, Elizabeth had been married 4 times, nearly died twice, and was the highest paid actress in history. But here's the thing, the logic we usually apply to her is that she was a spoiled empress who loved excess. Well, let's flip that. What if the excess wasn't about greed, but about ownership? You see, Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor was a London girl, born in 1932, but she wasn't a child for very long. By the age of 7, her family fled the war clouds of Europe for Los Angeles, and that's where the military campaign began. And I use that word specifically. Her mother, Sarah, didn't just want a star. She orchestrated a brand with the precision of a general. Every curl, every smile, every violet glance was calculated. Imagine being 10 years old and signing your life over to MGM. Psst, it sounds like a dream, right? But the studio system of the 1940s wasn't a playground, it was a factory that consumed children and spat out icons. While other kids were learning long division, Elizabeth was on a soundstage learning how to cry on cue. Her education was a disaster. She struggled to read and had to count on her fingers for basic math because the studio decided her face was more valuable than her brain. And then the moment that changed everything, 1944, National Velvet. There's a scene where she falls from a horse. In the movie, it's drama. In real life, it was a catastrophe. She fractured her spine. But because the property, that's what she was, property needed to keep filming, the injury was essentially ignored. Doctors patched her up and sent her back to work. That tiny crack in her vertebrae would haunt her for the next 67 years. Can you imagine? She was 12 years old and she had already started paying a physical debt to Hollywood that she would never fully clear. By 15, she was declared the most beautiful woman in the world. But behind the 19-inch waist and the perfect curves, Elizabeth Taylor was a woman who didn't own her own name, let alone her own time. She was a working property in a gown.
We often judge her for her carousel of marriages. I mean, 8 weddings is a lot, even by today's standards. But look at the first one, Nikki Hilton. She was 18, desperate to escape the studio and her mother. She thought a wedding ring was a get-out-of-jail-free card. Sigh, it wasn't. It was just a different kind of cage. Nikki Hilton was wealthy and handsome, but behind closed doors, the fairy tale turned dark. We're talking mental anguish and physical harm that led to a miscarriage. 8 months later, she was 19 and divorced. Most girls her age were just starting university. Elizabeth was already a used commodity in the eyes of the press. Here's my take. We look at her life and see excess. I look at her life and see a woman who was trying to buy back pieces of herself with every diamond Richard Burton gave her. If the world is going to treat you like an object, you might as well be the most expensive object in the room, right? But that first fracture, that tiny crack in 1944, was just the beginning of the downfall. It's the irony of her life. She could buy a kingdom, but she couldn't buy a spine that didn't hurt. So, we've talked about the factory that built her, but now we're getting into the moment the factory floor actually caught fire. The 1960s, Rome, Cleopatra. Honestly, if you were around back then, or even if you just love movie history, you know this wasn't just a film, it was a seismic event. 20th Century Fox was literally on the verge of bankruptcy. They were desperate. And Elizabeth, well, she knew it. She demanded $1 million, $1 million in 1960. When they agreed, she jokingly said, "If someone is crazy enough to offer me $1 million to make a movie, I certainly am not crazy enough to turn it down." But before a single frame was even shot in Rome, the price she was paying nearly doubled. In 1961, in London, she contracted pneumonia. And I'm not talking about a little cough, I'm talking last rites pneumonia. She was pronounced clinically dead for several minutes. Whew. To save her, doctors had to perform an emergency tracheotomy, literally cutting a hole in her throat so she could breathe.
Now, most stars would have hidden that scar. They would have layered on the makeup or worn high collars. Not Liz. She wore that scar like a badge of honor for the rest of her life. She said it made her human again. But the world didn't want her human, they wanted her as Cleopatra. And that's when Richard Burton walked onto the set. You've heard the legend, right? The great Welsh actor with the voice of God and the liver of a sailor. Their first meeting wasn't exactly love at first sight. He walked up to her, hungover and shaking, and tried to act cool. But Elizabeth, she saw right through it. She saw a messy, vulnerable man who was just as lonely as she was. On January 22nd, 1962, they filmed their first scene together. The director, Joseph Mankiewicz, yelled "cut," but they didn't stop. They just kept kissing. Yikes. The air in the room didn't just change, it vanished. Now, here's the logic reverse most people miss. We call it a scandal, but in reality, Elizabeth and Richard were the architects of the modern world we live in now. Before them, studios controlled your image. If you cheated, the studio buried it. But Liz and Dick, they didn't care. They took their love into the streets of Rome, and that is where the paparazzi were literally invented. Click, 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 click. Photographers were climbing trees, hiding in bushes, even dressing as priests just to get a shot of them on a yacht. It was absolute chaos. The Vatican, yes, the actual Vatican, published an open letter calling their relationship erotic vagrancy. I mean, come on, erotic vagrancy? That sounds like a great title for an indie album, but back then, it was a moral condemnation from the highest level of authority. People think Elizabeth stole Richard, but if you look at the letters, if you look at the raw data of their lives, it was a collision of two souls who were tired of being properties. She was Fox's property, he was the theatre's property. Together, they were just Liz and Dick. But here's the salty truth we don't talk about enough. Cleopatra cost $44 million. That's nearly $300 million today. It nearly killed the studio, but it birthed the celebrity as we know it. Elizabeth became the first person to realize that scandal wasn't a career ender, it was a currency. She didn't just survive the fallout, she owned the fallout. However, as the diamonds got bigger, and they got massive, the cracks in her health were widening too. The empire she was building with Richard was spectacular, but it was built on a foundation of scotch, pills, and a spine that was slowly turning into dust. When Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton finally tied the knot in March 1964, the world practically stopped spinning for a moment. It wasn't just a wedding, it was the climax of a global obsession. They held the ceremony at the Ritz-Carlton in Montreal with only 9 guests. Elizabeth wore a yellow chiffon dress with lilies of the valley tucked into her hair. She looked surprisingly soft. But don't let that fool you. That quiet moment was just the eye of a hurricane before they embarked on a decade of living like modern-day emperors. They lived on a scale that would make actual royalty blush. We're talking about jetting between villas in Switzerland, Mexico, and London. Richard once bought a yacht on a whim for nearly $1 million just because they enjoyed a single trip on it. It's the kind of wealth that feels fictional, isn't it? But for Elizabeth, the extravagance served a deeper purpose. Let's talk about the diamonds. People often mocked her for her obsession with jewelry, calling it vanity, but you have to understand the logic here. From the age of 10, Elizabeth had been owned by MGM.
Her mother controlled her hair, the studio controlled her time. She was a commodity. But a diamond is permanent. It's tangible. It was the only thing in her life that actually belonged to her and her alone. Richard understood this. He didn't just buy her gems, he was buying her pieces of a childhood she never had. There's a legendary story about the 33-carat croup diamond she wore everywhere. At a party, Princess Margaret saw it and told Elizabeth it was the most vulgar thing she'd ever seen. Can you imagine? Elizabeth didn't get offended. She just smiled and asked the princess if she'd like to try it on. When Margaret saw the way the light danced off the stone on her own finger, Elizabeth leaned in and whispered, "See, it's not so vulgar now, is it?" Click. That was Elizabeth, sharp, witty, and always one step ahead. But behind the Bulgari sweets and the champagne, something darker was brewing. Both of them were heavy drinkers, and both had tempers that could level a building. Richard famously described their relationship as living on the edge of an exciting volcano. He wrote in his diary that he would explode violently a few times a year, and Elizabeth would explode right back. He called it marvelous, but admit it, it sounds exhausting.
And this is where the salty reality kicks in. While they were playing at being gods, Elizabeth's body was starting to revolt. That old back injury from when she was 12, it wasn't going away. In fact, the weight of the elaborate costumes, the constant travel, and the lifestyle were making it worse. She began relying more and more on painkillers and alcohol just to get through the day. By 1974, the volcano finally erupted for the last time. Oh, so they thought. They divorced in June of that year, and the fallout was catastrophic. Elizabeth gained weight, her health spiraled, and she felt untethered. Without Richard, she wasn't sure who Elizabeth Taylor was supposed to be anymore. It's a classic case of a love so big it leaves no room for the people inside it to breathe. You see, the world wanted the drama, we wanted the diamonds and the screaming matches, but we didn't stop to ask what happened to the woman when the cameras stopped clicking. She had built a kingdom, but she was trapped inside it, surrounded by beautiful things that couldn't stop the physical and emotional pain from seeping in. The final act, and honestly, it's the most impressive part of the whole journey, because this is where Elizabeth Taylor stops being a property and starts being a pioneer. By the 1980s, Elizabeth's body was essentially in open revolt. The list of her medical issues reads like a textbook of catastrophic failures. Whew, we're talking over 100 hospitalizations and at least 30 major surgeries. That childhood back injury, it finally caught up. While filming a miniseries in 1985, she had to wear a period costume that weighed 50 pounds. Her spine, already fragile, just couldn't take it. She suffered more fractures, eventually leading to both hips being replaced. But here's a logic flip for you. Most people think she lived off her movie millions and Richard's diamonds. Well, think again. The bulk of her staggering wealth, estimated at nearly $1 billion, didn't come from Hollywood. It came from her nose. In 1987, she did something no serious actress did back then. She launched a perfume line, Passion and then White Diamonds. She wasn't just a face on a bottle, she personally supervised every scent. By the time she passed, her fragrance business had earned more than her entire 60-year acting career combined. She invented the celebrity brand before the internet even existed.
But money wasn't the goal anymore. In 1985, her close friend, Rock Hudson, died of AIDS. Back then, the world was terrified. People wouldn't even say the name of the disease out loud. But Elizabeth, she didn't care about image anymore. She used those famous violet eyes to stare down the stigma. She co-founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research when even the government was looking the other way. She turned her fame into a shield for people who were dying in the shadows. Honestly, that was her greatest performance, not Cleopatra, but the woman in a wheelchair, raising hundreds of millions for people the world had abandoned. The physical price remained high, though. By the late 90s, she had a seizure, a stroke, and then a benign brain tumor. Most people would have hidden away. Not Liz. She posed for Life magazine, bald, with the surgical scars clearly visible, looking directly at the camera. She said, "I'm living proof of survival. I've come through things that would have felled an ox." Ha! You have to love that defiance. When she finally took her last breath on March 23, 2011, at the age of 79, the world mourned the last true movie star. But if you look at the data, the story is deeper. Her jewelry collection alone fetched $115 million at auction. The Taylor Burton diamond, the La Peregrina pearl, all sold. But the money went to her foundation. You see, we wanted her beauty, so she gave it until her body broke. We wanted her scandals, so she gave us headlines until the Vatican intervened. But in the end, she took all that excess and turned it into a legacy of mercy. She lived like royalty, yes, but she proved that the true value of a queen isn't the crown she wears, it's what she does for her people when the lights go out. It's a bittersweet thought, isn't it? She spent her life buying diamonds to feel like she owned herself, only to give everything away to make sure others were seen. That's the real Elizabeth Taylor, a London girl who conquered the world, paid for it in pain, and somehow came out the other side as a hero.